If you turn back on your starting point and say, I will not go anywhere, I will not proceed with my geometry, with my investigation, with my business plans, until I am quite sure of my starting point, you will never begin. Because you can go back into your starting point forever. And that manifests itself in people who, for example, have certain kinds of hypochondria. The starting point is their body. They wonder, my goodness, ought I to go out? Would I catch cold? Would I get into an accident? Should I go to a foreign country? Would I get the great Siberian itch or the heebie-jeebies or trots or whatever? And so always worrying about the starting point. Now, are you quite sure that your premises are right? It's always good to look at your premises. But you very quickly come to the conclusion that if you don't have some premises, you won't go anywhere at all. So, as one general once said, a poor plan of attack carried out with zest and determination is much better than an excellent plan carried out in a wobbling way. So, in this way, for example, in Japan, I have no ideas really about talking Japanese. I know lots of words and no grammar. Therefore, I have no compunction whatsoever about talking, because I know it's mistakes all over the place. And if I were nervous about it, as they get nervous about talking English, because they do desperately want to be correct, I have absolutely no desire to be correct, because I know that in my whole lifetime I shall never be able to speak correct Japanese. So I just plunge in and I get understood. And that's the way you have to do in life. You muddle through. So if you keep turning back, you see, on the initial beginning point and trying to be sure of it, nothing will ever happen. So then, whatever is the point, whatever is the ground that we are and that we take our stand upon, appears to us as space, as not being there, to give us transparency. You see, if God were visible, nobody could see anything but God. It would blot out everything else. But by virtue of becoming invisible, the world is created. Because, as it were, God gets out of the way so that the world can appear. And the world is a selection. As I explained, the eyes select what they see because they are only noticing what goes on in a certain spectrum of light. If you could change the eye spectrum altogether, you would see a different world of creatures. Flip, flip, flip. You could have the thing like a radio tune and go on from performance to performance, all on different bands of a spectrum. To see them all at once, though, would be for our kind of intellect like taking your hands like this across the piano and going slam. You see, you just get this chaos of sound. So that there being realized objects in space is partly dependent upon our using an attentive and selective type of consciousness. You see, they're the same thing. If you have a selective consciousness, you have a selective world. So putting down the 5 fingers on the piano instead of the full flat arm selects a certain pattern of sound. And you can say it's a chord, it's a melody, and so on. So when the angels play their harps in heaven, they are selecting, they're the fingers of God selecting what kind of patterns are appearing in the world, you see. That's really what that image is about. So then, to see this, then, you go back to no thinking. The suspension of thought is, for modern man in particular, a tremendously important undertaking. When in about 1921, Ludwig Wittgenstein published a book called the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, it was the end of Western philosophy. Because where he finished, he said, philosophy is really a method for getting rid of meaningless concepts. And so he practically got rid of all metaphysical concepts and ended up by saying, whereof one cannot speak, of that one should be silent. This was the great moment for philosophy departments all over the Western world to lapse into silence and practice meditation. But instead, they had to go on talking because they couldn't prove that they were an academic discipline unless they did some talking, especially some publishing. So they began then to chatter nauseatingly about trivialities. They became grammarians, mathematical logicians and things. And everybody forgot about philosophy because it got so dull. It wasn't expressing any more man's fascination and wonder at the improbable situation of living in the universe. So, but fortunately, things are at last getting through to people. And you would not be entirely laughed out of court in academic surroundings today if you suggested that some non-verbal research be carried on. You would have to put it rather carefully. You would have to refrain from calling it yoga or Buddhism or meditation, but it would be sort of research in non-verbal sensory awareness or something, some kind of academic gobbledygook. But it's coming. And this presents problems to people who are compulsive thinkers. Because when they try to reach this completely non-verbal level, they think about doing it. They think, I'm trying to reach the non-verbal level. I'm trying to empty my mind of thoughts. I'm trying to think not thinking. You feel so sorry for those people. But it is an awful problem if you have it. And to get rid of it, then, one uses gimmicks. One uses methods of absorbing the individual in non-conceptual experiences. Such as you can play a single loud musical tone and get that going, and it really shatters thinking. It has you, just turns you into this, your whole body becomes this one tone. You get the person concentrated on that one point, you see, go, 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 and zip, cut it off. And we're off. You haven't had time to collect your thoughts. You're blown by this tone. And all those techniques that are used in yoga, when they chant, when they do some kind of physical exercises, when they have a nonsense proposition like a koan to concentrate on, all these things work in the same essential way, to suspend the analytical thinking, to suspend the spotlight mind for a while, so that you get back to what is called original mind, where you act without thinking. That's why in the whole interchange between a Zen teacher and his students, the Zen teacher is constantly challenging the student to respond intelligently to a given situation without thinking, without stopping to think, just as in, say, using judo. You mustn't stop to think. You're lost if you do. You must learn to respond without thinking. So creative skill in so many things depends upon the opposite of thinking. When you examine what people say, what inventors say, what artists say, what mathematicians say about the discovery of new ideas, very few of them arrived at those ideas by a purely thought, thinking, verbal or numerical process. And the reason is, of course, that the structures which we have arrived at and we do understand by analytical thinking, once you see them, they tend to stay put. They become habits. And there's nothing more difficult to cure in an individual than a habit of thought. You know, I've argued for hours and hours and hours sometimes with people who simply can't understand knowing without a knower, because they are so trapped by sentence structure. The verb has to have that subject. Therefore, you can't have a state of affairs in which there is just the verb, that is to say, knowing. And they say, well, who is knowing? And it's as bad as arguing with a flat earthist or a Jehovah's Witness. Impossible. Because of the ruts of thought. Now, such a person can never be inventive. Why? Because he will never see a new pattern and a new structure. And he won't see one because he's thinking all the time. He's not open to the variations of the actual world. And so he can only see what he's been taught to see. That's why academic psychology is always in a position of bafflement about learning theory. Because if learning is a process of converting new experience into the terms of what you've already learned, you never really learn at all. It's like, according to kind of a narrow-minded aerodynamics, bees cannot fly. Well, there's no way of explaining the aerodynamics of that vibration, but it flies. And you often come up against this when an inventor has an idea and all his colleagues say to him, oh, don't be silly. You can't do that. It just wouldn't work. Well, he says, I've tried it and it does work. Or they say, come on. And very often they won't even try. They'll just say it can't be done. You can get a fantastic dogmatism in the scientific world. And you have to be terribly careful not to upset certain absolutely fundamental, strictly prejudices, which are the result of thinking too much.